Hi, my name is Samantha DeRaedt, and these are my final conclusions on our term in my organizational paper. So, moving into the two organizations I selected, at the beginning of the term, I selected two organizations that to me felt like they could be related. They felt similar. They felt like they had a lot of the similar ideas, which were Flag State Honor Flight and Civil Air Patrol. Both having Qs, both having ties to the military, I felt that these two organizations could be represented under the same umbrella, and I could not have been more wrong. Flag State Honor Flight is an organization out of Findlay, Ohio that operates under the national chain of honor flights that takes veterans from their home in Toledo, Findlay, generally Ohio, Lower Michigan, and takes them to Washington, D.C. for a day of remembrance. So we're World War II, Korea, and Vietnam veterans. We take for a day of remembering, for a day of dignity, for a day of thankfulness that we hope to represent them in a way that they weren't represented when they returned from war. Civil Air Patrol, operating under the national chain of Civil Air Patrol, but the Toledo branch of the Civil Air Patrol out of the 1/8th Fighter Wing, I selected. In the organization itself works to help school-age children learn leadership skills similar to Boy Scouts and really enhance their general education and their ties to the community. So both these organizations, I felt, because their military ties were similar, and truly and honestly, I could not have been more wrong with the way that they're represented through the eyes of a nonprofit sector. So moving into part one, the context of institutional settings for a nonprofit sector. What makes these nonprofits? So looking at Flag State Honor Flight is it's a public charity. So not Flag State Honor Flight operates under donor representation. They're charity. They receive donors. They receive sponsorships, scholarships, grants, and that is how they generally operate. Where Civil Air Patrol is federally funded. So these two organizations, as we know from our textbook, have to serve the community in some way. And doing that, Flag State Honor Flight is contributing to the general public domain. They're representing veterans. They're helping veterans they're dignifying veterans. They're giving them thankfulness and really just helping that general realm. Whereas Civil Air Patrol, on the completely opposite spectrum, is representing school-age children, K to 12 children, in their growing leadership skills for careers they haven't had yet. So these organizations, Flag State Honor Flight, representing veterans in their 80s, 90s, who have had a lifelong career, who have served in the military, who have generally completed the majority of their life, and then on the other end, Civil Air Patrol, representing children who are just starting their life. So that is how they represent in the community their public sector and what makes them a nonprofit organization. Flag State Honor Flight also takes, as we know from our textbook, tax breaks are huge. Tax exempt is the huge portion of what really makes a nonprofit, which Flag State Honor Flight absolutely benefits from, the tax exempt realm. Being a 501 public charity, they're able to really utilize that tax exempt, whereas Civil Air Patrol is federally funded and does not need that same exemption. They have very low overhead. They utilize very little resources. The resources they do utilize are given to them from the 1/8th Fighter Wing, from general donations. It's a very, very small contribution, and they have very, very small overhead. And moving into chapter 2, where we're leading and governing the nonprofit organization. Flag State Honor Flight is led by a president and 11 board members, as well as hundreds, thousands of single-use volunteers. In talking about these single-use volunteers, I represent them as single-use volunteers, myself included, because they have the option to never come back. They're not generally sustained volunteers. They can go to one single flight and they never have to come back if they don't want to. They have the opportunity to return if they so choose, but they don't generally have to. Where we look at Civil Air Patrol, Lauren Anderson, their leader, Master Sergeant Lauren Anderson, is from the 1/8th Fighter Wing, and she represents Civil Air Patrol as their general leader. So there's no board for Toledo, Ohio sector. There's a national board that does keep accountable and that Lauren Anderson does report to. However, they're a very small organization that is local to the 1/8th Fighter Wing and only is represented by Lauren Anderson. So again, just a huge difference between these two organizations. When we look at Flag State Honor Flight, we were looking at these 11 board members holding, and President Steve holding each other accountable, representing sustainability, representing the board, and a general, what we consider, I think, a standard nonprofit. We have a president, we have a chair, we have a vice president, we have a treasurer, and we have general volunteers. So, and then generally we're looking at also the stakeholders behind these donor organizations. So for Flag State Honor Flight, we're looking at the donors, we're looking at the people who are charitably donating their money, charitably donating their time to this organization, and how they're represented in this organization as well. And then moving into Part three, we're managing the operations of the nonprofit. So strategy and adaptability are two of the most important foundational really baselines for what a nonprofit organization can and cannot do. So we need to be strategic when we plan. We need to be adaptable when, especially for something like Flag State Honor Flight, which is an enormous logistical operation. And we need to continue to have checks and balances to make sure that organization is being represented properly and without harm. So when we're looking at Flag State Honor Flight, we're looking at enormous bouts of training. So when we go on these flights, there's roughly 80 to 100 veterans that go on each flight. Each veteran gets an independent volunteer. That means there is over 100 volunteers in each flight. The board travels with each flight. There's wheelchair wranglers like myself who go with the flight. I'm not assigned to a veteran, but I get on the bus with everybody and I make sure all the wheelchairs are on and off. People are hydrated. I'm kind of just like a task rabbit, a general helper. And there's one for each bus. There's muscle guardians who help some of the veterans who are unable to walk. There's nurses who administer oxygen, who can give aid when aid is needed. And there is then the donors as well. So if there's a large single donor, they can also travel with the Flag State Honor Flight. So this huge logistical operation is the means to be managed. So these operations need to be trained immensely. So before each flight, we're looking at a single training for each flight, specifically for that flight, that goes over dignity training, respect training, general medical training, safety briefings, and we're looking at how each flight can operate to the best of its ability. We're looking at how to make each guardian, how to make each wheelchair wrangler, how to make each board member responsible for themselves, responsible for their general volunteers, and responsible for the betterment of the Veterans Day. And that's really an enormous logistical process that occurs every single flight, multiple times a year, 4 times a year. We're looking at these huge, huge trainings. And then when we move in to look at Civil Air Patrol, we're looking at a small scale operation. So when it comes to managing the operations, we're looking at small scale. However, it's still necessary for Master Sergeant Lauren Anderson to be accountable and to be sustainable for her organization. So although she's not chartering a plane, although she's not feeding 150 people per flight, she's looking at dealing with the responsibility of making sure that minor children are always in a safe environment, that their parents are informed of what's going on, that the National Council is represented properly, that they're giving feedback to each other, that their communication is flowing both ways. Objectives, regulations are all being flown to and from the organization, to and from the national board. So when we're looking at the managing the operations, we're looking at these, whether it's a large scale operation, chartering a plane, feeding hundreds of people, or we're looking at calling and texting parents, we're looking at operations that need to be sustained and that need to be strategic, because without strategy, we're not looking at long-term effect. Without strategy, something like Flag State Honor Flight could go completely awry. We're working with a single day, an extremely tight timeline, and extremely sensitive topics that we're working with. We're working with war veterans. Lauren Anderson's working with children. And these operations need to be utilized strategically to continue to really just to sustain them overall. And then we're looking at part 4, which is the really financial resource behind what is a nonprofit organization. And like I've said multiple times, these operations couldn't be more different, especially financially. And this is where they really split off. So Flag State Honor Flight needing donors, needing volunteers, needing support from the community. CAP has a federally funded operation. They don't have that type of need for community donations. Although I do think it could help them grow, they're at a huge advantage when it comes to sustainability. They are more sustained. Under the just general realm, they know they can continue their operation no matter what. Whereas the Flag State Honor Flight needs to represent themselves in a positive and really encouraging light for all. Help people understand their mission, help people really see what they're about. That way people want to be involved, whether it's donating their time, whether it's donating resources, whether it's donating envelopes they need, or tissues, or chapsticks, or sunscreen, or donating hundreds or thousands of dollars. They need to work with the community to ensure that they're being sustained financially. additionally to that, we need to make sure that the board is being sustained financially. So that's the board being 12 members. They need to checks and balance each other, whether it's the treasurer checking the president, whether it's the president checking a chair. They need to have checks and balances that continue to occur, to continue to sustain. That way, donors, stakeholders, the public, the volunteers know their money isn't being laundered, their items aren't being trashed, and that their money and resources are being fed back into what the organization really means. And when we're looking at when we're looking at a nonprofit public charity, we're looking at honesty for the public. And we're looking at wanting to make sure the public understands exactly what they're being given, what they're getting for their, you know, best bang for their buck. If they're donating their time, if they're donating their resources, that their resources, their time, their money is going to an organization that is fulfilling for that mission. Whereas CAP, as we know, is looking at a very small scale, federally funded, sustainable organization. And then we look at part 5, which is leading and managing people. So, like I've touched on a few times so far, Flaxseed Honor Flight trains their members each time, fresh start each time, no matter what. So someone like myself who continues to come back to this organization and continues to help. I've been through multiple trainings. It's the same upgraded training every single time. So we're going back and we're bettering training every single time for each volunteer as if they've never taken this training before. And that is to ensure that all members are at the same baseline of information. So whether I've had this training 10 times or one time, I'm at the same foundation of information. I have the exact same training, no matter what, for each flight, to ensure that these veterans are being cared for in the way that their mission intends, the way that Flaxseed Honor Flight, the way that Honor Flight in general intends their veterans to be represented. And then when we're looking at CAP, we're looking at a military style operation. So these children are being exposed to military operational styles, leadership ranks, and that's really great for when we're looking at the structured training, because the military is so rigid, and obviously it's not that rigid for children. But CAP really initiates that kind of structure and that kind of leadership, and it is independently sustained uh, independently sustained structure. So that is something a little easier on CAP. But what CAP I think is missing out in general is opening it up to the public. So opening up, and I think they're limiting themselves, and due to their federally funded, they don't need to reach out with the community. They don't need to do fundraisers. They don't need to implement themselves in the community. And I do think that is where they're lacking. And I think that with expansion, they could expand the entire organization and be more similar to something like a Boy Scouts, where they can get involved in the community. We see a Flag Honor Flight on social media rich in reach. And I think that CAP could really utilize some of those same pointers and really open up their organization. So thank you for listening. These organizations, again, couldn't be more separate, but really showed me and really helped me learn the differences and represent the huge differences behind what a nonprofit organization can be in society. The spectrum is just endless. So thank you for listening, and I hope you had a really great term.